Hey everyone, there's a new version of Redshift out with OCIO built in and ACES on by default. Let's go into Cinema 4D and check this out. Alright, here I am in Cinema 4D and I'm using S24 and I have installed the latest version of Redshift, which is 3.0.46, which has the OCIO built in and ACES on by default. So I've got the settings open here for Redshift render view, and you can see it seems to be pretty much the same. Display sRGB, and the view is using ACES 1.0 SDR/video. So this is going to be a little bit different than maybe what we were used to before with our own custom OCIO config. So basically, if we go into the settings here, we can see the difference. We now go into Redshift Globals, and we see there's a color management tab. And here is where we would input our own OCIO config file. And if you had a default OCIO config saved in your startup scene, in your new .c4d file, this may already be filled in with, I can just do it real quick if I go into the old one. And this is pulling in the ACES 1.2 config. And we still have some options here. You can utilize your own custom OCIO config, but without this in here, we are utilizing the version 2 OCIO config that's built into Redshift. And you'll notice some differences here. So this ACES 1.0 SDR video is an option in the latest version of the OCIO config, version 2. So I'll go into some of these things a little bit later, but right now we just want to leave this to default and our display set to sRGB and our rendering color space set to ACEScg. So basically what we have now is all of our OCIO config built into the core of Redshift. We don't need to go and download the OCIO config. It is built right in. So let me just pause this render here. Let me stop this. So right out of the gate, we are defaulting to rendering in ACES and using a display transform to take our high dynamic range ACEScg render in linear gamma, and we are transforming that into what can fit on our display. In this case, my displays are calibrated to sRGB color space, and so we're utilizing sRGB colors, and we're going to use the ACES 1.0 SDR video view transform. So we're going to take all that high dynamic range, tons of colors in ACES, and scrunch them down so they look right on our monitors. So everything is set up by default to be rendering inside of ACES color space and being transformed from ACES color space in our Redshift render view here to be displayed on our sRGB monitor or Rec 709 monitor if that's what your monitor is calibrated to. So in this case, I've got this sort of ridiculous scene here where I've just thrown some assets in here and just started testing out what things look like with this new version. And some of the great aspects of this new Redshift version, as I'll hit render here and talk through this. Okay, so I've got a cloner with little area lights set to sphere, and I've put them into a cloner. So I can go over here and show you. I've got a cloner with an area light set to a Kelvin temperature of about 2400, and then another area light with the Kelvin temperature set to 8700. And I'm just blending between those two in the cloner. And so you can see we're getting this sort of nice warm glow of the 2400 Kelvin all the way up to a nice cool color at 8700. So all of these color temperatures are now aware they're being rendered in ACES, where before 3200 or 2400 would be extremely orange. The color of this would be exaggerated because Redshift didn't take into account that these Kelvin temperatures were being transferred into ACES. So we were getting that same sort of color shift we would see when we tried to choose colors inside of Redshift, where we'd pick a color in our color picker and then render it in ACES, and we'd see it become much more saturated. So now this is being taken into account. Same thing with caustics. I've got the dispersion set to be pretty extreme here, but the refracted light coming out of this thing should be pretty natural. So now we've got the caustic dispersion being rendered in ACES. So we're not getting insanely blown out colors where we would have before. And so that just works out of the gate. You don't have to change any settings, color temperature, black body emission, caustics, anything. I believe now even the sky, the Redshift sky, these are all now being calculated through ACES. So we don't have to do anything extra. This just works out of the box. As soon as we set our render space in our color management tab to ACEScg, that's all being taken care of behind the scenes. We don't have to do anything. I have some materials here and I have some objects brought in. So like this is an asset that I brought in with the diffuse texture. And as you can see, underneath the path, we have a new tab here called color space. And Redshift will try to guess what you are wanting to do with this. So we know that this is a JPEG. So most likely this is going to be an sRGB JPEG. And Redshift, so far I've found that it does a good job at guessing. So auto, this is transforming this to ACES from an sRGB texture. If we click on this, we see we can select what it is. And if we wanted to go through and select and make sure that this is being transformed correctly, we would set this to sRGB. One thing I want to note, and I needed clarification on this, and luckily Saul Espinoza helped me out with this because I wasn't seeing just an input sRGB. And if you've watched my other ACES tutorials, you know I went in a little bit about how important it was to pick the correct input transform for our textures. And an incorrect method would be to select an output as the input. Even though that was used for a while, that led to some inaccuracies in rendering, so we don't want to do that. In this case, the only sRGB option I have here, other than just leaving it in auto and hoping it picks the correct one, is output sRGB. But as you can see, there is no change here. And talking to Saul, he was nice enough to explain that in version 2 of OCIO, there is a slight shift in the way these transforms are handled. And this is listed under output incorrectly. So this should just be out here with these other ones because we have Scene Linear, Rec 709, sRGB, and really these sRGB and Adobe RGB options shouldn't be under the output tab. They should just be living out here. So hopefully they do update that to avoid any confusion. But this would be still the correct choice for this texture. So this is an sRGB JPEG. If we want to make sure that we're using the right one, or I found that auto has worked well for me. So for roughness, this is a non-color map. This is just black and white, so we would set this to raw, no change. Same thing with a normal map, even though this does look colorful, this is being used as data, so we want to set this to raw. And displacement as well, set to raw. And it's the same thing here with our dome light. I have a dome light in the scene here, and the color space is set to auto, and I found that that is working correctly. But if we did want to go in and make sure, we would set this to Scene Linear, Rec 709, sRGB. This is an HDR image, and I know that that is what I would use in this case. If you've already converted your HDRs to ACEScg, you can still use them here. You could just go in and just select ACEScg if you had already pre-converted your texture. So there's no need to go back and change anything. You would just select the correct transform. In this case, though, I will select Scene Linear, Rec 709, sRGB. Quick note on this, Rec 709 and sRGB have the same color primaries. The difference between the two would be their gamma. Rec 709 has a slightly different gamma curve than sRGB, but in this case, because it's a linear gamma, they're both exactly the same thing. All right, so real quick, if I wanted to just add another element in here, I'll just do a new material from scratch. I'll just grab I guess like a plane and set it to Z minus probably and scale it down. Okay, I'm gonna make a new texture, new material, and I'm just gonna go grab a image. I'll just drag in a photo I took in Iceland, and this is just a JPEG. And under color space, I can leave it at auto and it does a good job, but if I wanted to make sure, I would just select sRGB, so I know that's what it is, and pipe this into the diffuse. And let's apply this to our plane. I'll turn bucket rendering off just to take a look at this. Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty good to me. Seems pretty close. Seems like that is working correctly. Now, granted, it's not going to look exactly the same because this is still going through that same ACES transform. So the whites on this image are not going to be as white as they are if I just pulled it up in the picture viewer here, but the colors should be pretty close, and seems to be right. So there's nothing else I really need to do here. This is all taken care of. I will note here, so on this color checker chart, let me just pull that material up. This chart is an EXR that is already converted to ACEScg, and I just set the color space to ACEScg instead of sRGB, and it's working perfectly. So it's really nice that we have the option to still use assets that have been converted. Same thing with HDRIs, opening up an old file or an old project file where we've already converted all of our assets. We can still utilize this new workflow with those old scenes. We just need to make sure that we're naming our transforms correctly. So we just want to go in and make sure that anything that is in ACEScg isn't accidentally being interpreted as sRGB. But it's as simple as just going and selecting it here. So the other aspect of this is exporting. So what happens now if we render this out? So we have some options here under our color settings. And so we've got our view where we can change this to log, raw, and untone mapped. We also have compensate for view transform checkbox. So if we were to render out an EXR as is, just like this, let's bring it into After Effects. So I'm going to render this out, and then we'll bring it into After Effects and see what happens and see what our EXR looks like. So I'm going to set that up now, and I will be back. All right, so that is done. Let's head over to After Effects. I've just pulled this in and put it into a new comp. Real quick, I do want to go over my project settings, same as before. I just have this set to sRGB, 32 bits per channel, and I do have linearize working space on. And you notice up here, let's go to the comp, and use display color management is checked. So we are seeing the same thing we saw in our render view here in After Effects. So this is the equivalent before when we would render EXRs out with color management turned on. We're basically baking in this view transform into our EXR, and I can show you the effect of that if I add a new layer and add an exposure. And if I increase this, you'll see how quickly these highlights blow out, and we're not really getting the full dynamic range of our render. Even though we've rendered out in an EXR, our values are clamped. So if you did want the control of doing color correction or changing things up in post, we need to make some changes when we render out of Cinema 4D. So let's go back into Cinema 4D. And if we want to have that control, and we're going to basically say, we're going to take our render and we're going to do the ACES transform from ACEScg to sRGB in After Effects, we need to go up to our project settings, our render settings, and go to Redshift color management. And we need to change the view from this SDR video to raw, and we need to uncheck compensate for view transform. So view is raw, compensate for view transform turned off. We go and save this as another version, and I'll render this out. You can see as I made the changes real quick, as I made the changes in the color settings, they've also updated here in the render settings in the render view. They both controlled the same thing. So let's hit render and see what this looks like in After Effects. All right, let's take this render into After Effects. Just put this right on top and turn off the exposure. And so big difference, right? We can see that this looks completely different. So now we need to take this and say, go from ACEScg into sRGB. So do a new layer. And in After Effects, I'm still using the OpenColorIO plugin, and I'm pointing to my OCIO config file, which is still ACES 1.2. I don't believe that causes any issues, but that is something I am still curious about because we're utilizing the new version of OpenColorIO in Redshift's settings. So we don't have the same OpenColorIO config we use to render, but I don't believe there's a difference between the ACEScg that's being used in this config that Redshift's using, the version 2.0, and the 1.2 that I'm utilizing in After Effects. But I will post any updates if I find out anything different. So for our input space, we want to use ACEScg, and for the output space, we want to select Output sRGB. And just like before, we need to compensate for the extra gamma that's being applied because After Effects doesn't know that we've already applied sRGB gamma, so it's applying another sRGB gamma curve for us. So we need to add a new layer and take a color profile converter and go from sRGB to sRGB, but we want to linearize output. And now we should be back at the same point we were before. So this is our original render where we had the compensate for view transform on, where we basically baked in the view transform and without it. So now we're back to where we need to be. But the beauty of this is now with an exposure put below our transform, we get much nicer results here. So we can take the exposure down and we're still maintaining all of our high dynamic range. So we can make adjustments and have the full range of color and exposure for our comp. So that's it. That would be the way to utilize the same workflow as before. We just need to select raw and make sure our compensate for view transform is turned off. To be honest, I'm not exactly clear on what's being done here. Compensate for view transform seems a little confusing to me, and I'm curious to know once they release the documentation exactly what this means and exactly what's happening. So as you can see here, I have some other tests that I've done where I tested the different outputs, and I've marked in red the ones that did not work. So I was turning on and off the view transform compensation, and I even tried some log renders, which work fine. I can go back here, and instead of raw, if we wanted to render in log, we could. And that may be tempting because as Sheb pointed out on the comments of my last ACES tutorial, when doing color correction in After Effects, if I add a new layer here, and apply a lumetri color, the color correction here doesn't work as expected. You know, raising the highlights or lowering the highlights seems a little bit counterintuitive. And Sheb was nice enough to comment and point out that lumetri is looking for log to color correct in a log gamma rather than linear, which makes sense once you mention that, because normally that's where coloring is done. Colorists would color grade footage from log. So it may be tempting to just, because it's easier to color grade in log, to render log, although I think the downside to that is we would lose the ability to render out AOVs and put the AOVs back together if we render straight in log. AOVs will not render in log. If I set this, I think I have some AOVs set up. Yeah, so we won't be able to put the AOVs back together in a log gamma. We need linear gamma in order to composite these correctly. So I would suggest to not render in log and do that step here. It's as simple as just adding another transform. So let's just duplicate this layer and we'll just turn these off for now. So this one, we want to go from ACEScg. Instead of sRGB, we want to add another level to this. And we're going to go ACEScg to ACEScct. And we'll select that here. And we'll go ACEScct. And then in this step, we're going to go ACEScct to sRGB. We just need to make the correction here. And so now, if I turn these back on, it should be exactly the same thing. If I pull this original one up top, there's no change. But we did do an intermediary step where we're now in log, and we can do our color correction now with Lumetri just fine. So this should behave a little more as expected because we're feeding in a log gamma instead of linear. If for some reason none of this interests you and you want to go back to the way it was before ACES was the default, you would have to, instead of ACEScg in the rendering space, you would have to go back to scene linear, Rec 709 sRGB, and the view would need to be untone mapped. So now this is giving you the same render before ACES was set to default. This would be like standard Redshift from like 3 years ago. I think that just about wraps it up. I can't think of any other settings we went through. I don't think there's any reason where you'd ever want to use an ACES rendering space untone mapped. I'm not aware of any use of that. If somebody knows a use for that, definitely let me know in the comments. I believe untone mapped would only be useful in the case where you wanted to go back to the days before OCIO involvement with Redshift. All right, I think that just about wraps it up. If there are any questions or comments, be sure to leave them down below. I'll be looking for any questions, and I will try to answer those as best I can, as quickly as possible. Thanks so much for watching. I have some new tutorials in the works, so stay tuned. Thanks so much, everybody.